What we're looking at next is the changing value proposition of scholarly communication and publishing. The digital affordances that we've been talking about all day yesterday and with the keynote last night have dramatically changed the costs associated with publishing, but also introduced a lot of new forms of scholarship, some of which is very expensive for us to manage, like data publishing. So we want to spend some time looking at the impact of those changes in the cost-benefit structure, and particularly the impact of those on institutions and publishers who are primarily the ones supporting and sustaining all of this activity. So on this panel, we will have 4 speakers. The introductory talk will be given by Greg Tannenbaum, who is a very well-known local consultant, former president of Berkeley Electronic Press, and a variety of publishers before that. I won't go into his CV in detail. You can look him up. But he's going to give the introductory talk and then moderate the session. We'll have 3 additional speakers, the third of which is joining us by Skype. So we'll see how that works out. And then we'll have hopefully about half the time, 30 to 40 minutes at the end for a panel discussion. And with that, I will turn things over to Greg.
Hi, thank you for being here. This has already been a fascinating conference. Diane's talk was terrific, and I'm hopefully not going to muck it up too badly and keep us on the rails until we get to what I'm sure is going to be a very good panel. Just to give you an overview of...
It's not hooked up to the...
There we go. Okay.
It's not hooked up
Oh.
there.
The visuals are not overwhelming, so I'm gonna talk whilst we go. I'm going to talk a little bit about the traditional value proposition within publishing, focusing really on journal publishing for a large part of the talk. Move over to talk about what has happened in the last 20 years or so as we moved into a digital environment and how that value proposition has changed for the key actors within the ecosystem. And then talk a little bit about how those changes have resulted in some evolving business considerations for those stakeholders. This is like one of the 2 slides where there's even a hint of a visual, so maybe I should pause dramatically. The traditional, that's better than what I have, so let's go with that. The traditional value proposition obviously has impact and impacts and is impacted by authors and reviewers and editors, libraries, the academy, publishers, and readers. And so we're going to talk a little bit about, for each of those categories, what the traditional value proposition is, or was, and how that has been impacted by, as I said, this shift to a digital environment. Todd, if you hear me, oh, you could wave hi. You were on for just a second. Okay, great. Terrific, thank you. Okay, so let's keep going here. In terms of the author's perspective, by the way, the bullet points that I have on these slides, they're by no means meant to be authoritative or exhaustive. They're meant to further the conversation and get us thinking about some of the issues that our panelists are going to talk about. But from an author's perspective, the traditional journal publishing system had, there were several assumptions that were baked into that over time. One is that you would have your arguments strengthened by going through the peer review process. The mere fact that something went through peer review, there was an assumption that the argument was stronger going out than coming in. The second bullet point, this talk about claim staking, the idea is traditionally, if you published on a given topic, you could reasonably lay claim that you had some degree of expertise or you were an expert on a given subject, largely, again, by virtue of your publication history in that field. The third and the fourth bullet points, validation of research and imprimatur, they're sort of two sides of the same coin. The former refers to the fact that someone has read and approved the article, and the latter refers hopefully to someone prestigious having read and approved of your article. And so authors were deriving value from both of those. And then, of course, the last bullet point, impact and reach, that refers broadly to the correlation between publishing a journal article and being known in your field, being referred to in your field, being able to secure grant money, tenure and promotion, some of the things that Diane talked about in terms of how authors value peer review. I'm going to go through reviewers and editors fairly quickly. Like Diane, I'm also referring to reviewers and editors, or editors specifically, as the academic editors as opposed to the paid professional editors. Here, when we think about the value that they got from the traditional journal publishing model over a period of years, and I should mention, the first slide had a graphic of a Royal Society journal, the first journal from 1665 or so, and really the era that I'm talking about spans the 1660s to the 1990s. So this was a very well-established system, and these norms were really well baked into the system. Again, reviewers and editors could say, look, we're contributing to the scholarly discourse, to the scientific discourse. We're strengthening the arguments that are coming in by virtue of the work that we put in to ask challenging questions and to polish the writing and so forth. That, of course, is a form of discipline, a form of service to the discipline. Implicitly, they were getting a pay-it-forward equation in the sense that if they did this, there was the hope that when they submitted their articles, they would receive the same treatment from others. And there's, of course, some at least modest professional recognition, more from the editor side, but from the reviewer side, but be able to put on your CV, I was an editor for this journal, or I was on the board of that journal. There was some professional benefit that could be reaped there. In terms of the library's perspective, what did the library get out of the traditional journal publishing system? What was their value proposition? Well, one is their mission, providing their patrons with relevant resources. Even today, we're at UC Davis, obviously, the library mission statement is that the university library advances the success and the impact of the UC Davis community by providing access to, expert assistance with, and stewardship of recorded knowledge. So that remains true today, right? I mean, that's the library's job in large part. Traditionally, they were making some value judgments. They were performing a pre-sifting of content, if you will, by deciding this journal is worth having in our collection, this one is not. So there was a filtering mechanism that the library provided there. Slightly contradictory to that was also the notion that libraries could, at least for many years, through strategic serials acquisitions policies, they could feel confident that they were getting all the knowledge or most of the knowledge that was worth collecting on a given topic. From the Academy's perspective, and Diane talked about this better than I ever could, but journals certainly traditionally were a proxy for a work's quality, for the quality of research, and by extension the quality of a researcher. And that was through a combination of a publication's reputation and also its impact factor. And then also this second bullet point, validating an institution's standing in a given discipline. If you were at an institution, that institution was generating a lot of articles that were published in the New England Journal of Medicine, for example, that institution could reasonably lay claim to having some standing in that field. We publish a lot of articles in these prestigious journals. We are good in this field. And from the reader's perspective, obviously, peer review, as I mentioned before, someone has vetted this, someone has looked at it, someone has strengthened the argument, someone has said this is not junk science, this is not junk research. The hierarchy of journals, this notion that there was an informal pecking order within the journal, so you sort of knew if something was published here versus here, the time and the attention and the value that you could and should give it would be adjusted accordingly. And in that last bullet, there was a time, seems like a long time ago, but picking up an issue of a favorite journal was an easy way to keep abreast of developments in your field and in adjacent fields, and you could do so in one handy bound container. You could pick it up and hold it. So from the publisher's perspective, the equation, the value proposition from 1665 to 1995 was actually quite straightforward, that they would provide value in the ways that were just articulated to the authors and the reviewers and the editors and the libraries and the academy and the readers, and in return, they would receive subscription income that would perpetuate that value proposition. It was a pretty straightforward equation. Then there was this transition, and soak in this graphic, because as I said, there's like 3 in the whole presentation, so this is about as dynamic as it gets. It's a Netscape browser circa mid-1990s. But you know, we had this model that we accepted for 300 or so years, and there was peer review, there were subscriptions, there was tenure and promotion, there was impact, all the things that I talked about. The advent of electronic publishing specifically, and the digital environment generally, has changed or threatens to change virtually every aspect of that traditional publishing value proposition. So, you know, on one hand, what I'm saying here is that the internet is a big deal, which I know is a really trenchant analysis, so you're welcome for that. But if we look at it specifically, I think we can see some ways that it's really provoking a lot of interesting questions in a period of change that we're not quite through yet. We're in the midst of. Let's go back and revisit quickly all of those value propositions. So, strengthening of the argument via the peer review process. We see the most popular journal in the world today is PLOS One. It is a technically correct journal. So there's peer review, but it's peer review at a different level. Is this stuff basically right? Yes, we'll publish it. What that means, and the advent of lots of other mega journals like that, peer review has a different value now than it did 20, 30 years ago, certainly 300 years ago. Being able to stake your claim. I am an expert in X because I published in journal Y. Well, there's a lot of ways to stake your claim now. You can obviously have a social media profile. People are savvy about how they promote themselves and their works. Journals being a validation of research. There are 20,000 journals, approximately 20,000 active journals today. Who is not validated? You can find validation from someone somewhere in this system. So the overall notion of validation is lessened. And also, as Diane mentioned, as the talks yesterday mentioned, as we'll hear today, there are so many disparate types of content beyond the journal article now, and the journal can't really validate them. It doesn't quite know what to do with them. I won't speak too much about the imprimatur, the notion that if you have a brand, it's worth something. In a digital environment, it's easy to take a flagship product and expand it. Nature has 36 titles now. There's some erosion that comes with that. And then this notion of impact and reach. There are many, many ways, if you are a researcher, to get in touch with your audience. There are many ways to disintermediate the publisher and the journal if you are so inclined. From the reviewers and editors' perspective, and I'm really not going to spend much time on this slide at all, but the dynamics have changed fairly dramatically. I'll just focus on the first one, this notion of the peer review strengthening and the journal strengthening scientific arguments. Peer review, as we know, as we have heard and will hear more of, is not infallible. And here I'm talking about not just things like the open access scam that Science ran their flawed expose on, but more qualitative work and more substantive work like what the Cochrane collaboration did. And they found that, this is a quote, little empirical evidence is available to support the use of editorial peer review as a mechanism to ensure the quality of biomedical research. So peer review being this stamp of approval, again, doesn't mean quite as much as it should. And so therefore, the effort and the role that the reviewers and the editors play is changing. From the library's perspective, being able to provide patrons with relevant resources, obviously that's still the library's job, one of its primary missions. But now, of course, in a digital environment with Google Scholar and Microsoft Academic Search and Google, there's a rise in self-service discovery. There again is disintermediation. The researcher can get at that directly. And also there is a really long tail of content that gets longer daily. So even if the library is trying to be the curator of resources, to get one's arms around just the journal content is very, very difficult to do. And then you factor in, of course, that there is more than just 2 million journal articles that are being published annually. There's all this other content. There are performance videos, and there are patents, and there are architectural designs, and things like that. It's complicated, of course. And then the other point, the middle point there, being able, the library's performing a pre-sifting of content. Collection development obviously has changed over the years in the electronic environment. So the sort of surgical acquisition strategy has given way, not totally, but in many ways, to a quantitative strategy. We can get the big deal. We're getting all these journals for this heavy discount. Or we can acquire this database that has this many million resources. Not necessarily which resources they are, but the volume of them. And so obviously that's something that has emerged again in the last 20 years or so. From the Academy's perspective, we said that journals and the journal the proposition, value proposition for the Academy when we talked about journals, traditionally, one of the issues was, or one of the benefits was tenure and promotion and being able to use journals as sort of a proxy tool in that process. Well, certainly, we know now, obviously, that we can do much more at the article level as opposed to the journal level in terms of impact. And Jason will be talking about that later today, I'm sure, and others. And we also know that there are these alternative metrics. So it's not just article level metrics, it's alt metrics. There are lots of interesting fine-grained mechanisms that are evolving and that are coming into the market that will allow us to use a better tool to measure impact than just the container in which the article was published. The idea that publishing, one's faculty publishing a lot in a given journal or series of journals could validate that institution's standing. Again, journals don't represent the boundaries. There's lots of other ways by which people are disseminating their information now. And also, there are lots of ways by which the institution can measure and can articulate its standing in given disciplines. So CRISs and institutional repositories and institutional analytics and comparison tools all exist to be able to do that in a much more surgical manner. From the reader's perspective, again, this notion that peer review in and of itself is a pre-sifter of content. We talked about the +1 model and how that sort of undermines it. We talked about how there are lots of journals. Many of them are low to mid-tier. So the fact that something has been peer-reviewed and published means less today than it did 100 or 200 years ago. There are not lots of non-journal content forms, and those are disseminated in lots of different ways. And they're validated. It can be validated in lots of different ways. So in other words, that last sub-bullet under the first bullet, validation from other sources is possible. People can understand what is useful to them, what is important to them, what is important in the field by means other than this was published in Nature. If someone tweets about it that you trust, if someone pings you on Mendeley to say, hey, here's a paper I think that you would be interested in, and that's someone that you trust and respect, that matters. In terms of the hierarchy of journals, we've talked about that. There's lots of them now. In some ways, it means the hierarchy is more important because I can only trust this small batch within this great flood. In other ways, the whole thing is just overwhelming. And of course, issues don't exist anymore. What do I got? Okay, I'll speak. I'll do, is Jason Preem, I'll warm the audience up for, oh, he's not here. So I'll do a Jason approximation of talking 100 million miles an hour. In terms of publishers, truthfully, the value proposition is really the same in a sense. They're going to provide value to all these stakeholders, and in return, they're going to get money. But the value that they're providing to those stakeholders has, in fact, changed. And so the sort of business considerations that are associated with that are also changing. This is a slide from, or a screenshot from the Scholarly Kitchen from Kent Anderson. He wrote a piece, 73 things that publishers do. Why I bring this up is if you look at the list of 73 things, whether you think it's an accurate and complete list or not, doesn't really matter for this exercise. All of the tasks that are on that list, all of them have been impacted by this digital transition. They're all different than if we looked at that list 20 years ago. Some of them, of course, wouldn't exist. So search engine optimization that would not have been on the list in 1985, certainly. Others are more indirect, so how you manage your sales force. That's obviously what they're selling and how they manage leads and things like that. That's all very different in a digital environment. From a library's perspective, there are also changes, of course, in the digital realm. Some of those are obvious. So the library thinking about how it values, how it acquires, how it preserves non-traditional content, things that aren't journals. What do we do with them? What's our responsibility? How do we catalog them? Other things are sort of more practical and maybe less obvious. So we have this great serials checking infrastructure. What do we do with it? What do we do about it? It's always good to end with a picture of Lyndon Johnson, so that's what I'm going to do. There's a reason for this. It's probably an apocryphal story, but it's a speechwriter in 1968. A speechwriter for Johnson was very disgruntled and was planning to resign, and he was going to do so in a spectacular fashion. Johnson was going to give a speech from the Oval Office, and this guy wrote the speech, loaded it onto the teleprompter, and it was going to go something like, "My fellow Americans, I come to you today from the Oval Office to reveal to you my plan for immediately ending the Vietnam War." And then it was going to slide down. I also have a plan to solve the civil rights crisis and to win the war on poverty. Slides down. It was then going to be blank, and Johnson was going to be on his own. So the reason I bring that up is I fear in some level that what I've done is I've hung my fellow speakers out to dry in the sense that I've raised a bunch of big issues, I've set some expectations, then I've said, here, have at it, see what you can do. But what I'm hoping is that we can hear, that we can hear from them a discussion of these different aspects of the changing value proposition that hopefully I articulated, and what they're doing to normalize that value proposition, and the efforts that they're making to sort of uncomplicate these complicated issues that are playing out. So I'm gonna stop there. I'm gonna turn it over to Pete Binfield. I'm not gonna give you a long bio. Pete is the co-founder and El Jefe of PeerJ, and before that he was at PLOS One and Sage and a variety of other interesting places, and he is gonna talk to you next. So thank you.
Actually, should already be.
That's it, yeah.
And would you like notes pages?
No, just normal, thanks. Okay, thank you very much, Greg. And thanks to Jonathan for inviting me here. Very pleased to be talking to this meeting. It's an interesting, important meeting, and it's Valentine's Day, hence the monkey. So this is Charlie, our company mascot, named after Charles Darwin. So yeah, I'm with PeerJ. Before that, I ran PLOS One through until May 2012. So I left in May 2012 to co-found PeerJ, which is sort of cut from the mega journal model. But we like to think it's PLOS One plus. So it takes the PLOS One model and moves it on a bit, hopefully. So I'm going to be talking a little bit just about the value proposition changes perhaps that the PeerJ brings, and also just from the point of view of a publisher. So we have a few people with different backgrounds on this panel. So this is very much from a publisher's point of view. So just to start with PeerJ, what we believe. So we didn't write a mission statement, but these are our sort of corporate beliefs, that we want to keep innovating, that we remember who we serve. That's the academics, of course, not the other way around, the academics serving us, which seems to be the way a lot of publishers act. And importantly, we want to pass on the savings of an improved system back to the academic community. So what do we have? So if you don't know about PeerJ and what we are, so the company is PeerJ, and then we have two products, PeerJ, the peer-reviewed journal, and PeerJ Preprints, which is a preprint server, that launched in April. So the preprint server started publishing articles in April. The journal itself launched in February. So we actually just celebrated our 1-year anniversary 2 days ago of publishing articles. So the interesting things I think about PeerJ is probably the most interesting thing for this panel discussion is the entirely new business model. And I'll go into that a little bit. The journal itself is incredibly broad-based across all of biology and medicine and health sciences. It peer reviews the similar way to PLOS ONE, only for technical, scientific, methodological validity, not for impact or audience or readership. We operate what we think is a rather nice optional open peer review process that I can definitely talk about if people are interested, but it's not really the focus of this panel area. But we allow peer reviewers to provide their names to the system, and then we allow authors to publish their peer review audit trail alongside the published paper, and both of those are optional. And then we have a rather nice Q&A feedback commenting system built in, and that's built into both sites, the journal and the preprint server. And then we have the preprint server, which is very much integrated in the site. It's also covering the same subject areas as PeerJ. It allows versioning. There is this close integration with the journal, but obviously it's not required. If you're in the preprint server, you're not required to publish in the journal and vice versa. And it has the feedback as well. What is important, I think, for this panel is we've built this entirely ourselves from our own technology. So most publishers out there actually use third-party providers for important chunks of their technology. They buy in a peer review system from Aries or ScholarOne. They use a third-party platform from Highwire, Adapon. Their commenting system might be, a plugin on their website or something. And we think that was that's a mistake of many of these big players because they lose control of their environment. They lose control of the knowledge of their users and what their users are doing within their various systems. And as a result, we think we've got something superior because of that. And the end result is we've built something that has new features, new functionalities, which has really sort of come out of the business model that we've adopted, which this is the business model. So for us, individuals become, as it were, members. They're not described as members, but they buy a lifetime publication plan with us. So it's a one-off fee. They pay a single payment, which gives them the lifetime ability to then publish articles for free with us thereafter. And it's incredibly cheap. So $99 buys them a basic publication plan that allows them to publish one article per year for free for life. And we have the enhanced, which is $199, which allows them to publish 2 articles a year, and the investigator, which is the true all-you-can-eat plan, which is $299. You can publish as many articles as you want per year for free for life. The big catch in the model is that every co-author on an article has to have a plan with the right level. So it's not $99 for the article, it's $99 for the individual. And that takes a bit of, people need to get their head around that, I think, sometimes. They see this model and they immediately think, oh, per article, not, it's per individual. But the important thing, I think, about this is that because we've got a business plan wrapped around the individual and a requirement to serve that individual so that they come back and bring more papers, a lot of our functionality has ended up quite interesting, wrapped around that sort of person-centric mentality. So just to jump out perhaps to the ecosystem. So we have PeerJ preprints, obviously, so you can come as an author and submit to that for free. You don't need to have a paid plan for that. You can version, you can get Q&A feedback, you can update it, and then at some point you can decide it's suitable to go into the journal and hit a button in the software. It's all the same submission interface and database, so you just sort of swap over to the peer review journal and go into peer review. It comes out peer review, presumably accepted and published, and again, you can get Q&A feedback, you can ask questions, answer questions, and eventually, perhaps you've got a new version of the article and it can go back around the loop again. And like I say, it's all enabled by this business model, which has been described in various ways by the Twitter wags. So this was when we launched it, actually June 2012, when we announced it, innovation or madness. So I think a lot of people have sort of questioned the business model. But in reality, it's not mad. It's entirely sensible. And it's been validated by a lot of people have kicked the tires. We've published 500 articles now in this model, roughly split 50-50 between the preprint server and the journal. 20 universities have now signed up for sort of university level covering the publication plans for their faculty. Stanford was the most recent one we announced just a few days ago. We've won awards and had great reviews. You know, we won the ALPSP Award for Publishing Innovation just in October for 2013. That's a big deal award. Actually, and PLOS ONE won that award previously a few years back. The Chronicle of Higher Education named us one of the top 10 educational technology innovators. So the model has been well received by the industry. And I think one of the interesting things in the way that we change the value proposition here is to do with our academic contribution system, which is again related to the fact that we know who each individual is in the system and every interaction they have, and we care about them at the sort of individual level as an individual plan holder. So in our system, people get credit for everything that they do, and don't focus on the points assigned here, but focus on the fact that sort of every interaction they have in our system they can get credit for, and we can show that back to the world. So if you're a reviewer, you can get credit. If you're an open reviewer, you provide your name, you can get more credit. If you're an author, if you ask a question, if you answer a question, all of these things are now contributions to the academic communication system that can be tracked and sort of shown back to the users. So we have some rather nice functionality that was just rolled out a couple of weeks ago. If you go to our site and run a search for something, you'll see in the right-hand corner a little table pop up of, as it were, the top authors or the top editors. And if you click through that, you get to this page, which is, as it were, a leaderboard of the top authors, the top reviewers, the top editors, how many points they've accrued as each of those roles, and by subject area as well. I don't think we have live internet on this, but I could show you it live. But it's rather nice. You know, you can drill down into, for instance, ecology and find out who is the top reviewer in ecology. 70 points here simply indicates these people have reviewed twice. They get 35 points per review. So the database isn't huge yet because, you know, we're only a year old and we've only published a few hundred articles. But you can see the way this is going at the moment. Thanks, yeah. Okay, and then my final slide, in fact. So I wanted to sort of pose some questions for the panel discussion section. You know, how does the business model that you use as a publisher change what you do as a publisher? So if you're a subscription publisher selling physical print product, you've got a warehouse, you've got a sales force, you've got a legal department that defends your copyright concerned and so on. You're carrying a lot of costs in your infrastructure simply because of the business model you're trying to support. You can move on, as it were, to an open access publisher, which is online only open access. Suddenly you don't need a lot of those things. You don't need a legal department because it's all open access. You don't need a distribution arm because it's all online. And then you move on a little bit further, and perhaps you've got a membership model like us. So it's still open access, it's online only, but it's a membership model. So now, whereas someone like PLOS ONE has to bill each publication, APC fee, now we don't bill each publication. Each publication is free. We've billed the person once, they've come and signed up with us once, and we can make the whole process more efficient and effective that way. So I think it's important as a publisher to think, what is your business model constraining you to do, and what would a change in your model allow you to do? And then there's the issue of our legacy systems or legacy mindsets holding you back. And there's really two things in this bullet. So legacy systems are, you know, you use Highwire Press, you use ScholarOne. You're stuck with their functionality. You don't control your own environment, unlike us, that we do. Or a legacy mindset. You know, you're hung up on this concept of prestige, having the most impactful journal, having the most sort of important brand. But if you get away from that into, say, the PLOS ONE mindset, where you're not hung up on prestige anymore, suddenly you can grow to become the largest journal in the world in 5 years. And they published 31,000 articles last year. And then this bottom one, and this is sort of where we think of ourselves, are you a publishing company which happens to use technology, which I think is sort of the old mindset, almost the pre-internet mindset, or are you actually a technology company that happens to publish, or not happens to publish, a technology company which does publishing, which is very much how we think of ourselves, I think. So everything that we're doing in the publishing world is being enabled by the fact that we're really set up as a technology company that can do this in an interesting way. And that's my overview of sort of changing the value proposition from the point of view of Peerjay. Thank you.
Oops. I'm not sure. Oh, oops, not notes pages. Okay, there it goes. Okay, so thank you for joining me this morning. My name is Allison Fish, and I'm here at UC Davis. Just started with the ICIS project as a postdoc. And thank you for spending the time with me today. Today I'm going to talk about A Tale of Two Intangible Cultural Heritage Archives. And I really want to talk about this because something's not quite, yeah, actually it's a little messy. But no, let me just change the view. Let's see if. Is that like, okay, perfect. So scholarly communication today is taking place in a landscape where technologies are changing, and this is being linked to the aggressive expansion of intellectual property rights, as we heard last night. Moreover, this is causing many, both within the academy and outside, to rethink how expertise, credit, attribution, and authorship within collaborative research communities are recognized, and how value is distributed based upon that recognition. I personally, in a lot of my research, have been interested in the role that IP plays in this changing landscape as one of the prime mechanisms for value capture and manipulation. And I've looked primarily at this question with respect to intangible cultural heritage because for a number of reasons I find it a good object to think with. For one thing, cultural heritage is of interest across the academy, I believe, albeit in different ways, to the humanities, to the social sciences, and increasingly, intangible cultural heritage is legible as a valuable area of research in the sciences, especially when you're thinking about traditional environmental knowledge or complementary and alternative medicine. Moreover, it is a topic that demonstrates the academy's connections to the world. Specifically, I'm thinking about the connections between researchers and cultural stewards, or the individuals within communities who are the gatekeepers of access to this intangible cultural heritage knowledge. And finally, it is my thought that when heritage becomes the site of data or the source of data production, the role of cultural stewards in this research endeavor can fluctuate, and that fluctuation can produce more or less productive collaborative encounters, and some of those roles are more conducive to access than others. And two ones that I want to talk about today, two different roles of, that a cultural steward might take on in a research collaborative, is where the cultural steward or the holder of knowledge becomes the object of study, or when they become the partner in the study itself. And I want to talk to you about two different archives that I've been involved with over the past 15 years or so in different capacities that are being spearheaded by the indigenous communities are in question, and in an effort to try and switch their roles from being objects of study to instead being partners in research themselves. The first one that I'm going to probably spend the most time with is India's Traditional Knowledge Digital Library, which began in 2001. And it's a web-based archive that currently is accessible only to patent examiners in different patent offices around the world. And its purpose is to document and preserve and prevent the piracy of 5 systems of South Asian classical medicine, which are Ayurveda, Unani, Siddha, homeopathy, naturopathy, and finally yoga. And the second one that I want to talk about is one that I was involved in the late 1990s, which is the Southern Paiute Education and Training Program that's related to assessing the environmental impact of the Glen Canyon Dam along the Colorado River. And it's a digitized and print archive used for Southern Paiute public educational purposes, and it's documenting ethnobotanical knowledge, namely the uses, or the various cultural uses of 67 plant species along the river. So I'm probably going to spend most of the talk here today talking to you about the TKDL, but if time permitting, I want to talk about the Southern Paiute Partnership, given time constraints. So the Traditional Knowledge Digital Library was initially designed and developed as what I call a techno-legal tool. And the way that the lead director of this particular archive explained it to me is that it's a particular use of technology that's designed to fill the gaps in the patent system in order to make an anti-patent device for traditional knowledge that is already known and there's prior art available, it's just not easily accessible. The immediate motivation for the development of this archive was multiple instances of biopiracy in the 1980s and 1990s that came to the attention of various officials within the Indian central government. And these are attempts to patent aspects of basmati rice, neem oil, and finally turmeric for wound healing purposes. However, it's also connected up with a longer history of taking without attribution that in the South Asian subcontinent related to, for example, the taking of material plant specimens by the, for example, British Royal Botanical Institute, and actually Charles Darwin as well in his Beagle trip. And so there's a longer history with this sort of tension and discomfort with biopiracy within the South Asian subcontinent that's being championed by the Indian central government in this case. However, the TKDL is being designed primarily around the experience with the legal challenge on the patent for turmeric, which was a patent that was registered by the University of Mississippi based upon the research of two Indian expatriate faculty, Suman K. Das and Harihar Kohli, in the 1990s. And basically, what happened was that Dr. Das and Dr. Kohli felt that they desired to popularize what they believed was an effective remedy for wounds that failed to heal, which was turmeric, and it was sort of folk knowledge or kitchen knowledge in India. And in order to do that in the United States, they have talked about how they felt to do that here, you have to develop it, and that required sending it through randomized clinical trials as well as registering patent claims to it. So what turmeric is, it's the product of a flowering plant that's indigenous to South and Southeast Asia, and it's a distinctive yellow powder that probably a lot of you have in your kitchens that you use as a cooking spice. However, in Ayurvedic medical knowledge or practice, it's also used as an antibacterial agent against inflammation and infection. The related U.S. patent claim for turmeric was based upon the research of the two men I mentioned, who admit to knowing of the traditional uses prior to their research, but justified their decision to apply for patent protection because, quote, they felt that the compound should be popularized. And the only way to do that here is to develop it, and you can't do that without a patent, unquote. When the patent was granted in 1995, it soon caused outrage within various parts of India and the world, and amongst indigenous rights communities as well, and in developing nations around the world as well. So in reaction, members for the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in India, on behalf of the nation and through private counsel in Delhi, spearheaded a legal challenge that requested the USPTO revoke the patent. However, because the challenge had to be brought ex parte, meaning that the Indian state could not actually be an official party to the request for revocation of the patent, what the Indian nation state could do through their ministries was to submit evidence supporting revocation. Thus, the Indian legal team focused primarily on providing proof that the patent had been inappropriately granted because it failed the central patent criterion of novelty. Specifically, the Delhi legal team searched out and brought forward hundreds of texts, most of which were in South Asian languages and in out-of-the-way archives that had been published over the last 2 centuries that documented turmeric's well-known medicinal uses on the subcontinent. The lawyers selected the 30 best textual examples and spent most of the costs for certified English translations that were then submitted as evidence for revocation. And here's some Xeroxes of one of the evidences of prior art that was submitted to USPTO, as well as its English translation. In 1999, the revocation moved forward and was granted. However, in addition to not recognizing the Indian nation-state party as a legitimate origin or as a legitimate party before the agency, the patent challenges, individual patent challenges, are costly, inefficient, and have uncertain outcomes. And so there was strong incentive for members of the Indian state that were interested in this matter to develop a more proactive and preventative strategy regarding cultural piracy. As the project lead explained to me, the process for turmeric patent challenges ended, and we wanted to know what is the key problem here. It is clear that Indian traditional knowledge is well documented, but it's in languages like Persian and Sanskrit, and these books are not accessible to these international patent offices. And even if they were accessible, then they would not have been understood. So the prior art exists, but only the knowledge of this prior art is not available. And then we realized the extent of misappropriation is more than 2,000 such patents every year. Some of that misappropriation coming from universities and some of it coming from corporate entities. So in order to address this gap in what he saw, in the law that he saw, the project lead, who is a computer scientist by training, and cleared some space in his schedule and secured funds to gather a team together to develop and design the traditional knowledge digital library. And in doing this, he actually draws upon, 3 minutes? Okay. He actually drew upon scholars throughout India that are actually involved in South Asian classical systems of medicine. So understanding the Indian context, there are accredited universities that grant both undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in Ayurveda, in yoga, in Siddha. So it is considered a scholarly domain there. And so they work together with biomedical experts, computer scientists, all to create the traditional knowledge digital library. So it's an academic governmental partnership, this particular digital archive. And what this archive does is it goes through a process of digitization that relies upon a 3-tiered level of translation. And these are a linguistic translation to translate the source text into what they call the 5 international patent languages that are most commonly used in patent claims, English being one of them. It also requires scientific translation, so the compounds and therapies that are documented in source texts for Ayurveda are then translated into biomedical and bioscientific knowledge. And then finally, there's a legal translation involved, that different aspects of each entry are assigned assigned into a classificatory scheme with a code that mirrors the international patent classificatory scheme as well. So with this translation process, this is the output that you get if you do a search for turmeric in the TKDL. And it has the name of the remedy of treatment, the codes, the components of treatments, preparation, application, dosage, and finally the original source date, including year and page number. So this database is then made available to patent offices around the world that enter into agreement with the Indian central government, so that the patent examiners in these other jurisdictions might have evidence of that prior art. So the database has primarily been used by the TKDL to notify other patent offices of claims that should be revoked. However, in recent years, patent offices around the world have actually started to use the digital library themselves without being sort of poked and prodded and saying, hey, we think this patent claim is suspect. So you see a sort of snowballing effect. For example, actually one patent filed by the University of California was recently revoked in Australia for the use of grape seed extract in reducing acne and inflammation around the face. So it is sort of interesting in that sense. Additionally, it has also at times been suggested that this database will be used as a platform for research and development in partnership with the Indian central government, and that these partnerships could be formed between scholarly communities, but also between corporate entities as well, and they would be brokered through benefit sharing agreements that would ensure that some oversight remains with the Indian central government, and that they would continue to share in the profit. So they're really trying to transition their role as being an object of study by these researchers to being a partner in the research themselves. And that said, the future partnership between the researchers and the cultural stewards of the Indian central government that is envisioned is still one that's mediated by the patent and is partly inspired by really negative feelings and negative cases. So in some senses, the access to the TKDL is always going to be somewhat limited, or at this point looks to be somewhat limited, or extremely limited. So sort of to give you a different understanding of how cultural stewards and researchers can work as stewards or can work together as partners in research, I want to turn to a second archive that I worked with in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Southern Paiute Consortium's Education and Training Program, which is a collaboration with applied anthropologists, geographers. And so it's been developed for and through intergenerational transfer. It's really being spearheaded by the Southern Paiutes and assisted. There's some contributing factors that make it go forward, that things like Eric talked about yesterday, where it's a small group with trust. I think Victoria also referenced this. But there's also challenges. Most of the scholars involved aren't getting any credit for their work, and it's a huge time commitment, 20 plus years, 2 weeks for a year for 12 years to go on these river trips. And I'll wrap it up there and hand it over to Todd. So it's not getting me out of there.
All right. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone. So I'd like to talk today.
Hold on a sec, Todd.
Yep.
Hold on.
Okay.
Can we plug in the mic? Can you talk again?
I can talk again.
That's good.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for letting me Skype into this. It's been great to hear the other presentation. So today I want to talk about bringing data into the fold. Do the slides display okay?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, thanks. And I was asked to talk specifically a little bit about Dryad as a model, business model. So I'll zoom in on that in the middle of the talk. So I want to start with some notes about sort of this knowledge business that we're in, and I'm sure many other speakers during the conference have already made some of these points, so I won't belabor it. But the research outputs that we produce and that we get credit for are in part decided by this very traditional, slow-moving, conservative business of subscriptions and database purchases from academic libraries, and we can see those traditional systems move very slowly. There's also incentives from promotion and hiring and tenure committees and so on, and they may not always be aligned, as we've heard, and so there may be some outputs that researchers seek to get credit for or see as valuable or see as core things that they can get funding to produce that may not be easy to disseminate or easy to get credit for, or there may not be a market for in the sort of traditional subscription model. So one thing that open access does, and I think Peter alluded to this a little bit, is it opens up an avenue for researchers who have this incentive to produce this stuff and disseminate this stuff and get credit for this stuff to actually get it out there, even if the slow-moving dinosaur of scholarly communication doesn't necessarily keep up with producing new venues for those kinds of works, be it software or data or videos or other kinds of work. So let me just harken back to this study from a few years back from the Publishing Research Consortium that asked about 3,800 scientists and engineers across the world, mostly the developed world, obviously, what they valued in terms of the importance of access to different kinds of research outputs and what the ease of access for those different research outputs was. And where you want to be, I don't know if you can see my pointer sliding along there, is up here in the upper right, where it's very high importance, but also high access for research articles. Thanks. And where you don't want to be is down here in the lower right, where it's relatively important to have access to data sets and algorithms and computer programs, but the ease of access is very low. So this is one reason why there's been a fair amount of focus on data and software as opposed to many of the other scholarly outputs that don't rank as high in general importance. So one way to achieve this is to look at the traditional models of getting credit and getting scholarly communication out there. So the journal has often been classified as having these four major functions. There's the registration, that work has been done, sort of the claiming of credit. There's the certification, which is the imprimatur of peer review and the prestige of the journal. There's the dissemination of that by putting it on library shelves or putting it online. And there's the archiving of it for long term, so it's still available decades later. And traditional journals do this well with articles. They do some of this with data, with software, with other kinds of outputs. So you may be able to claim that you've produced data in an article, even if you aren't actually sharing the data through the article. The methods that you describe may be certified. You may have limited dissemination through supplemental online materials or invitations for people to contact you for receiving a copy of things that aren't part of the article, and archiving is also limited. So some of the roles are there in a germinal way in journals for data and software, but they're not fully realized. But the incentives for producing data and software and getting credit for it and doing a good job in curating one's own output for data and software are growing. So in the US, we've seen funding agencies begin to require or strongly recommend data sharing on an increasing speed, particularly with the recent memo from the White House OSTP that various agencies are responding to. I'll talk in a moment about how we also see this kinds of incentive arising from journals and from publishers. So let's look at what data actually are and aren't currently conveyed in journal articles. So just a very simple schematic. This data pyramid shows at the top the very small amount of tables and figures and supplements that people do already provide with their articles, which the publishers have responsibility for. And at the bottom, there's large masses of raw data and software, some of which never sees the light of day because they're not trustworthy or the results aren't deemed worthy of publishing, or they're too raw to be understood by anyone outside of the original research group, even other members of the same research group. And then there's the stuff in the middle, which is where a lot of the attention on publishing is going, which is data that's associated with, fairly closely tied to an article, the larger data set that doesn't fit in supplemental materials, the software that the lab group maintains to do the analysis. And generally, most recommendations from funders, from publishers, and so on are that these kinds of output should live in repositories of various kinds. One solution to dealing with that middle layer of the pyramid that's kind of a neglected stepchild of scholarly communication is to have a journal that's specifically for that research output type. So we've seen in the past couple years the launch of a number of data journals, prominent among them a new data journal from Nature Publishing Group called Scientific Data, and you can see from their marketing material there how they are marketing this similarly to how you would see a journal. article, and we've seen, to a lesser extent, but still some journals arise for the publication of software. So, for instance, the Journal of Open Research Software from Ubiquity Press. And so these basically hack, in the good sense of the word, the sort of journal culture for getting these kinds of research outputs out in a way. And they're both author pays open access style models in which there's incentive to produce these, researchers want to claim credit for them, but traditional venues don't exist for them. So there's relatively rapid evolution by launching of journals with these kinds of niche services. But that doesn't account for the mass of data that's associated with traditional journal articles. And as Greg mentioned, there's up to 2 million of these published a year, many of which do have valuable data or valuable software attached to them. So Dryad, the repository that I'm associated with, has been developed in support of an effort among a bunch of evolutionary biology and ecology journals to strengthen their journal data archiving policies. And this is the sort of joint policy that was negotiated among about a dozen such journals a few years ago, went into effect in 2011, and is becoming kind of accepted in the norm within the field. And we hope to have evidence from large-scale surveys soon of just how much culture change we've seen since the introduction of this policy. But it basically says that as a condition for publication, data supporting the results in the article should be deposited in an appropriate public archive, and it leaves to the journal the detailed implementation of that and allowance for exceptions and embargoes and so on a journal-by-journal basis. So Dryad was developed, as I said, to support this policy. It's basically a repository of data associated with published articles and only with published articles, so you can't just throw a data set up there. And it's leveraging much of the journal culture. So the submission of data can be integrated with submission of the manuscript. The journals may give access to the data for review, and all the features to support the policy, such as embargoes and so on, are kind of built in a customizable way on a journal-by-journal basis. So when a data set comes through Dryad and the paper is published, the data is published as well on the site with its own DOI, as you can see in the lower half of the slide. So here's the article in Ecology Letters. Here's the data in Dryad. Slightly different author list because the authors that were responsible for the data set are a little different than the authors that were responsible for different parts of the article. One can monitor how much usage that the data set is getting independently of the article, and one can independently cite it. So this is a model that really leverages the culture of journal publication, but at the same time allows for functionality in a repository that publishers don't provide in supplementary online materials. There are a variety of different repositories that can be broken down by a number of dimensions. I think two of the most important are sort of the community focus, so whether they are for any kind of data, whether they're for more focused data. So actually, I think GenBank's probably in the wrong position there, but things like Figshare, which will take data from any discipline at the top and at the far right, and things like institutional repositories, which work for particular institutions, particular universities, but work across disciplines in the lower right. So we can array the world of repositories along these various axes, and they differ more than just by these two dimensions. So they have also what kinds of files they allow, what kind of curation they do, how data access is achieved, and the funding model. And there's so many of these that registries have begun to grow up to allow people to find them and allow librarians to understand what kinds of services there are out there for the researchers that they support. So RE3 Data and DataBib, chief among those registries. So the question with all of these, and they all approach it in different ways, how to enable the different stakeholders to contribute to this infrastructure. And institutional repositories will focus on universities and libraries at the top of that circle, and funders may focus on things like GenBank for DNA sequences. But they're all of these stakeholders have an interest in journals to varying degrees. And so what Dryad has tried to do is experiment with a way that would allow all of these stakeholders to contribute in a small way to the ongoing sustainability and governance of the open data infrastructure. So back in September of last year, Dryad began to introduce data publishing charges to help sustain this repository. And you can see the price schedule here. There's also membership fees, and members, among other things, they have a role in governance, but they also get a discount on the data publishing charges. So these range, depending on where you are on this price schedule, between $65 and $80, with the incentives structured in such a way that it encourages the data publishing charges to be sponsored by sponsored by organizations as opposed to paid for by individual researchers, although it's possible for an individual researcher who doesn't have a sponsor to come and deposit their article. It also has built-in things such as waivers for low-income countries and increased fees for large data sets and so on. But the basic rate is between 65 and 80, depending on whether it's sponsored by a member or whether it's being paid by an individual investigator. And so a researcher can come to Dryad and search for what journal they are publishing in and see what the status is. So for instance, if you're publishing in the American Naturalist, the submission is integrated. You submit it upon acceptance rather than at review. You're allowed to embargo the data. The metadata will be hidden until publication, not in this case. And ASN, the society, will sponsor the publication charge for that data. Below that is a publisher that sponsors the publication charge for the data. Below that is a journal where the costs are left to the author. So you can see here a variety, societies, publishers, individuals, different stakeholders, depending on where the community is at with respect to their finances and respect to their willingness to support open data. And if the journal's not in this list below, then the cost to the submitter is $90, which if they're not from an integrated journal. So we have, at the present time, over 40 sponsors of charges. Most of them are journals or publishers or societies, but not all of them, and I'll mention one that isn't. And many of these, but not all of these organizations are also members, so they help sustain the repository also through fees, but have a say in the governance as well. So the one that isn't is this Canadian Healthy Oceans Network, which is a research collaborative that's funded by Canadian government. So it's an example of an organization that can step up to sustain data publishing infrastructure. We hope to have many more of these. And it's something of an experiment to see where the take-up is the greatest. Is it going to be the greatest among institutions sponsoring data publishing for their researchers, for journals and societies, for their members, for research collaboratives like this that have grant funding? Ultimately, much of the source of funding are coming from funders, but the funding is not coming directly to the repository. It's coming through this market that data publishing charges allow us to maintain. So I'll close there. Just to say that there's mainstream recognition of the intangible value of data, and I'm sure you've heard this from many other people over the last couple days, but there's a lot of angst over how to bring it into the fold of scholarly communication, how to get credit for data, how to fund it, how to understand what the value that data have at various levels of curation. The Dryad experiment basically is leveraging journals to collaboratively provide for data these traditional roles, the registration, the certification, the dissemination, the archiving, and to sustain it through this modification of sort of the open access economy, data publication charges and membership fees. And with that, I will let Lyndon Johnson turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
Do we have questions from the audience?
Database. What's the main purpose of it? If you're contrasting it with the. Hello. You were contrasting it with the patent thing, and so is its main purpose to disseminate knowledge intergenerationally, or what is its reason for, like, its most prominent reason for being?
So I guess that might also depend upon the perspective that you're actually looking at it. So it's funded by a grant from a U.S. governmental agency that's been charged with doing an environmental impact statement of the Glen Canyon Dam. Part of EIS's environmental impact statements usually require consultation and collaboration with tribes in the area. Southern Paiute has lands of cultural significance along the river. So they, from the perspective of the Bureau of Reclamation, I believe it is, the purpose of that archive might be monitoring of the health of the plants over time. They collect information every year that they do this river trip that's 2 weeks long, and they actually take rafts down the river, but it's also, they bring elders and youth with them. There's language learning because Southern Paiute language isn't spoken with the younger generations as much, so it's a chance to learn the language. It's also a chance to learn about the cultural significance of the various plants at different times of the year as well. So for the Paiutes, the Southern Paiutes themselves, the purpose is intergenerational knowledge transfer. They also do tourist education, so many people are rafting down the river at this time, so they often interact with tourists and also do intercultural education as well. So that's in the creation of the archive. The archive itself is can be used for any of those purposes, I guess.
Okay, and one question real quick, based on your responses here. You said the plants, surveying the plants at different times of the year, but I thought it was just 2 weeks. Do they rotate the time of the year in those 2 weeks, or what? That those 2 weeks occur?
I haven't really been involved with that since I left the University of Arizona in 2003, but I think it's actually not different time. I think it's over the course of the years. I misspoke there, but it's mostly a summer trip because that's when the availability of, kids from school, the researchers aren't teaching.
You mentioned the value proposition to readers, and I think that traditionally is where a lot of the revenue came from, right? Either directly or through libraries, subscriptions, and other things. And in a lot of these new models, there really isn't any way to capture the value to the readers. So I wonder if the panel could speculate a little bit about whether we should give up on that. And I don't necessarily mean money, but just capturing the value to the ultimate audience of the research. Because right now it seems like we've gone from one extreme to the other extreme through the open access model, which is sort of the default for a lot of these newer forms of scholarly communication, like data and like blogs and so on. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, actually, the next panel coming up is addressing that. Of course, the alt metrics are very important, where you can actually track what readers are doing with an article, how they're reading it, how they're interacting. So that's a new way of basically surfacing what was the value to that reader at that point. We obviously do clickstream analysis on the site, and I think perhaps publishers don't do very much of that kind of thing, tracking again what parts of the site, what interaction, what functionality do the readers actually use? Therefore, what do they value, and what can we iterate on? Again, our site allows us to do that. If you've got a high wire site or an add-upon site, I don't know how possible that is for a normal publisher, for instance.
I'd say, I mean, traditionally, the value for the reader is the knowledge they can extract from it and the follow-on research they can do from it. And historically, there was a constriction, right? I mean, to get at that information, it had to flow through the journals, had to go through whatever process it went through, and then get to the readers. And now, so the journals were performing a gatekeeping function in that sense. And now, we've gone almost to the other extreme, which is there's so much information out there. The information which is valuable to you as a reader, which is useful to you as a researcher, is out there. It's finding it efficiently, which becomes the problem, right? And it's not finding it. You can find it quickly in the sense that it gets from the mind of the original researcher out into the ether in incredibly rapid fashion compared to 30, 40, 50 years ago. But because that's the case, because the barriers have been lowered so dramatically, there's so much out there that cutting through the clutter becomes a challenge.
So it sounds like the answer is that you could capture that value through added value kinds of services that aren't charging for the actual step, but making the lives of researchers more efficient, right?
Actually, that's sort of one of our explicit expectations that we'll be able to do is by the act of having published work, we'll be able to, we'll know more about the interactions, we'll know a bit more about people's desires, and be able to, as you just exactly said, create new products, and perhaps even new products that can be charged for, based on that sort of data exhaust of people's interaction in the publishing sphere, and therefore not have to charge for the act of publishing in the first place.
Hello, Neil from UC Press. This is a question to Pete. You spoke a bit about being a technology company that publishes, and being more in control of what you do rather than outsourcing it. How much does that cost? Is that something you can divulge?
It really hasn't cost very much. I'm not the technical guy, so I am the publishing guy. I can't code anything. But my co-founder Jason Hoyt was the chief data scientist at Mendeley. He sort of built a lot of their system and their data infrastructure. So we have Jason Hoyt, who he's the CEO and co-founder, but also does a ton of the programming. And we have a lead engineer, Alf Eaton, who was previously at Nature and Mendeley. And then we have basically a sysadmin role. So Patrick on our staff does the sysadmin, which is a lot of the stuff up on the Amazon cloud, basically. Our entire infrastructure is on the cloud. The company owns 5 laptops, and that's our entire physical technical infrastructure. But so to answer your question more exactly, those basically the two guys, Alf and Jason, between them spent 3 months each, so roughly 6 person months building the submission and peer review system up to version 1.0, and then a similar amount of time, so roughly 6 person months on the publication platform. And then obviously it's been iterated since then. But we were able to launch with effectively one person year worth of development work.
Hi, Ben Kane. I'm a postdoc here at UC Davis. And my question is sort of on one of the topics that I hope to hear from the panel about is this idea of changing the way we look at publishing so that it puts value on the effort that people put into the system. And I think that one of the things that's a little bit busted about our system right now is that we recognize that publishers do a lot of stuff to put in like the value that we're talking about with maintaining the databases and having it look good, which is an important part of things. But reviewers don't get paid. That point was made earlier, and the way that we look at the publishing after the fact doesn't necessarily reflect the effort that was put in. And I think Diane talked about this a little bit at the beginning, where people don't put in the time to put in the effort for like a big data set before tenure because it's not worth it when they come up for tenure review. And so what I just like to get some perspective on how we can change that and some avenues to really changing the value proposition of publishing so that it values the effort that scientists are put in and other academics are putting into it.
From an economic perspective, the publishers are doing what their customers tell them they value. So, I mean, the publishers aren't going to proactively say, we now value data as a co-equal to the journal article unless their customers demand that. So that's on the academy. That's not on the publishers, as far as I'm concerned.
I'd like to speak to that a bit. So this distinction between publishers and researchers misses an important ingredient, which is that many of the journals that are out there are actually published in cooperation with scholarly societies. And scholarly societies certainly have the interest of the academy, at least in part. So what we've seen around data policy and experimentation with setting guidelines that are greater than the current academic community is necessarily comfortable with for what get into published works. I think that's really the society's taking leadership role. I don't think we should neglect their ability to change the culture, both of the researchers and the publishers.
Well, I would agree with you that that's not the publisher's problem. It really is the academy's problem.
But just one point on that, though, which is if the academy does decide and societies do decide that this is something they value, commercial publishers, commercial entities will try to monetize that. They'll try to figure out a way to make a business off of that. So it's not just about saying we value this. If the academy or the societies are going to be strategic about it, they should think this issue through pretty carefully in terms of the environment that they want to create.
I think as well that there is an element of giving people what they don't think that they want yet. You know, the fact that we've been able to do those leaderboards and show all the contributions in the system, you know, nobody necessarily asked for that, and perhaps they weren't even aware. You know, the academy wasn't necessarily aware that that could be tracked at that level and shown back to the users. So there is, you know, there's an opportunity for publishers to be experimental and to try new things because, you know, they've got the control of that information. But ultimately, you're exactly right. You know, if nobody values that, or if we get a lot of complaints about it, then we wouldn't provide it, basically.
I mean, I guess just to follow up on that, I guess we're all here in this room because we're thinking about what to ask for, right? And we're identifying a bunch of problems, and then, you know, well, what do we ask the publishers for? What do we demand of the people who are we are their customers? And, you know, I think that's...
But in the case of data, I really don't think it's I think the publishers are secondary to the equation. I think that the research funders, we see now, and Todd obviously has spoken to this and can speak to it further, but they're the ones who are saying, articulating policies for data sharing because they see it as a social good and they see it as advancing the pace of research and discovery. And they're saying, if you take our money, these are the policies you need to abide by. And I think that track is much more likely to be effective in accelerating the elevation of research data than anything a publisher can or will do in the short term. Todd, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, so I think it's difficult for funders to enforce those policies, and really the front lines are the journals. So whether you say the journal is a publisher or whether the journal is the community of editors and reviewers and those who set the guidelines for what gets in or not, that's why I mentioned the scholarly societies earlier, because I think they're really the leaders in setting what those guidelines are. So the funders create the sort of environment for the incentive, but unless it's realized by the research community itself through their journals, it won't happen.
And there has been examples of that happening in the past. The deposition of clinical trials data, for instance, was sort of requested by the academy, and then journals basically enforce it. You now can't publish an article about a clinical trial unless you've deposited the data according to the standards that the community has requested the journals enforce.
So I'm really curious for the whole panel, but maybe in particular, Diane, comments on the differences that are seen between fields, which you talked about a lot in your talk, and whether or not you also see, I mean, how much is that sort of dependent upon the institutions where people reside versus, say, the culture of practice of like physics? Is there anything like tenure-giving institutions because of the hierarchy and tenure that are different than, say, community colleges than companies?
I think teaching-intensive institutions, teaching-intensive institutions, many are, I think, wrongheadedly demanding publications from their faculty. That we heard. So that's one issue. There are some institutions that want to strengthen a field. Digital humanities might be an example, where there's where the product doesn't look like a duck and it doesn't walk like a duck, and there's a lot more flexibility in a particular department with a nascent field that will allow a little room to move. Harvard and Yale have terrible reputations for tenure. I'm sure I'm not the only one in the room who knows that. We talked to individuals in many institutions that said, hey, we make a decision before we hire someone, that we want them to succeed, they're vetted early. It's not, nobody's gunning for them. And as one provost said to me, a scholar here has to be incredibly clueless not to know what is needed for advancement to get tenure. So I think there's a lot of variability between sectors of higher education and among different research universities. But I do think that there is that imperative to have a suite of accomplishments anchored by a stellar publication record.
Can I just follow up? You mentioned the word company. Can I just ask, you seem to be very focused on tenure and promotion, but I came from an industrial research lab, and I think there's a very interesting comparison to be made that might educate the academy in that regard. Could you speak to that, please?
I don't work in a research lab, so I can't really comment on that. I will tell you that we talked to a variety of individuals at NASA, which is a completely different, and in a way they were such outliers from our perspective because we needed to focus, you know, we couldn't cover the entire waterfront. And people, one of the critiques of our work is, well, why didn't you look at teaching intensive institutions? Well, time, money. I can tell you my story. And that is, I am in what's called the Professional Research Series. I'm not a tenured professor. I go through the same process that a tenured faculty member goes through. I go to the same committee, the budget committee. But I am reviewed differently than a faculty member who is teaching and doing any other number of activities related to that part of their role. I will also tell you that at the beginning of my career at Berkeley, people didn't understand what I was doing. There was no field, there was nobody to peer review my work. But I have to say our last report, which I do want to put I want you to know that what I was talking about today was a teeny overview of what we published in this area. It's about a 700-page report with 7 very thickly described case studies, and it's a great read if you're interested in a field. But my director, who used to be the provost of the entire UC system and also the provost at Berkeley at an earlier iteration, I was coming up for review, and he said, well, what are we going to do about you're not having published in very many formal journals. And I said, you've got to be friggin' kidding me. After what we've done, what we've written, what we've espoused, you're telling me that this doesn't count? 5 years plus of work. And so what I did was altmetrics. I mean, I basically, and my postdocs, we just scoured the web. We published the interviews in a very interesting way, I think. It kind of slices through those 7 protocols or protocol questions. And so it's kind of a conversation. It was an immense amount of work, and Mellon said, why don't you publish them? But it's an incredible amount of work. But one of the processes, because we did this under human subjects protection, is that I had to get approval from each and every individual to sign off on publishing their comments. And I did have some individuals said, take it out. But that was a form of peer review. Not in a formal publication kind of peer review. So there were a whole bunch of metrics that I submitted in my advancement case. And it was fine. Everybody was pleased with it. And I do other things as well, other types of research and service. So I don't know if that answers your question, and I do know that it's different.
I would argue that actually NASA is not an outlier. It's something to contrast the academy with, along with IBM and Bell Labs and the like. So that was my point. Thanks.
I have a quick follow-up to Jonathan's question. That is, I was just looking at the list of the journals that support Dryad, and they're all of them from the life sciences. That is, I've not seen anything from physics, engineering, math. So here we're talking about data, but we're really talking about data from the life sciences. Can any of you comment on the absence of the very substantial parts of academia, such as the physical sciences, social sciences, humanities, and everything?
Well, Michigan has a very long-standing data repository, the name of which completely escapes me. Yeah. So Eric mentioned the human relations area files. So I think that they're pieces from other fields that are scattered around.
Todd, do you want to speak on Dryad's behalf on that issue?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. There's other disciplines and other fields. I didn't have time to enumerate the fairly complex landscape of them. Dryad is focused on biology and some medical journals as well, just largely because it grew out of this effort among evolutionary biology journals. We do actually have some physics and social science data as well, but there are Dataverse and ICPSR and other solutions for social sciences, and not every field is covered, but hopefully that's changing.
We really appreciate it. I know there are a lot of other questions, but I also know people presumably want their coffee. So we are here. We're not going anywhere, but we'll take our break now. And thank you to all the panelists, and thank you for your questions.